Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore. Well, today we are going to talk about the Sisters of Battle's Seraphim. I do feel like I haven't been given the sisters enough attention, really. In part because I did do a large video on them and the age of apostasy, but in a way, that video was almost as much about, the age of apostasy as it was the Sisters of Battle. However, their stories are also intrinsically linked with one another, and the Seraphim are no exception to that rule. In fact, they are quite the opposite, as they are trained and organized as a direct throwback to the Sisters of Battle's origins on the world of San Leor. Way back in the 36th millennium, you see, the Sisters of Battle were not the Sisters of Battle at all. They were not the Adeptus Sororitas, nor were they a military order. They were simply an imperial cult. A local community of faithfuls, like millions of other imperial cults scattered all throughout the Imperium. As we've talked about previously, the ecclesiarchy is far from a monolith, or should I say, the imperial faith is far from a monolith, as different planets, different sectors, different regions have many traditions, saints, and beliefs that are unique to their areas. In the case of this imperial cult, which referred to itself as the Daughters of the Emperor, they had three characteristics that would eventually make them very famous indeed, to the point where at the time the most important man in the entire Imperium would come to seek them out personally. First was their incredible devotion and their purity of faith, their absolute and unflinching belief in the God Emperor. Secondly, was the violence with which they were willing to protect that faith, and the skill at arms with which they employed that violence. And thirdly, quite remarkably, considering point number 2, was the fact that it was an all-female order, and one with incredibly stringent recruitment standards as well. This combination of factors eventually saw their fame spread to the point where it caught the attention of the agents of a man by the name of Gog Vandir, the High Lord of the Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy, the most powerful man in the entire Imperium, and the one who would eventually plunge the whole damn thing into an enormous and bloody civil war known as the Age of Apostasy. Realizing the potential usefulness of an extraordinarily martially gifted collection of warrior women, you can hardly blame him for seeing the promise in such a thing, Gog Vandir decided to make a great showing of travelling all the way to San Leor, accompanied by his private army and that of the Ecclesiarchy, the Frateres Templars. Tens of thousands of soldiers would go along with him as an honor guard. They would march into the city ahead of him and line up in a procession all the way up to the headquarters of the Daughters of the Emperor, who initially actually shut their doors in Gog Vandir's face, refusing to recognize his claim to divinity as being a direct representative of the God Emperor. But after a little bit of trickery, which we shan't go into in too much detail here so as to not make this another Gog Vandir video, he managed to convince the sisters that yes, he was truly divine, but at the very least, close enough to it that it made no difference. The Daughters of the Emperor swore to follow and obey him, and so he took them from the tiny world of San Leor and brought them all the way back to Holy Terra, where he renamed them the Brides of the Emperor, and began the process of shaping them into his own private elite army corps and bodyguards. Now, at the time of the brides of the emperor leaving San Leor, they only counted some 500 sisters. But under Gog Vandir's personal patronage, and due to his many wars, their numbers swelled rapidly, to the point where eventually they became a fully fledged army in their own right. They were amongst the last faithful defenders of the imperial palace, as Gog Vandir's military star eventually began to wane during the last few years of the Age of Apostasy. It was even the sisters who finally put the crazed ecclesiarch dictator down, after having realized that they had been deceived. In so doing, they also returned to the name they had held before, Daughters of the Emperor. They probably expected to all be executed for their part in the Age of Apostasy and having fought on the side of the traitor, but the new ruler of the ecclesiarchy, Sebastian Thor, had very different plans for them indeed. He introduced the Decree Passive, which forbade the ecclesiarchy from ever again having any men under arms. But, well, even the church needs a degree of protection. Even our own papacy have the Swiss Guard, after all. And so Sebastian Thor decided to retain the services of the Daughters of the Emperor. But even after all the preceding warfare, their numbers were still quite considerable. They had been holding the imperial palace quite successfully against the loyalist armies. And so as to make sure that his retention of the daughters could not possibly be seen as a threatening military maneuver, Thor decided to divide them into 4 orders militants. And this is where our tale, finally, of the Seraphim themselves can begin. I figured you needed the intro because the Seraphim were created at some point past the Age of Apostasy specifically to be a return to the traditions of San Leor, in all due likelihood to correct some perceived flaw within the sisters themselves, some perceived spiritual failing, perhaps, that had seen them deceived by the apostate Gog Vandir. Or maybe they saw this simply as a way to honor their tradition and their original foundation, or simply as a way to seek back to their deepest roots when they were at their purest, when they were fully dedicated to the God Emperor and the destruction of the heretic. Regardless of the reason, they began training their finest sisters in the arts of far more improvised combat, shall we say, as back in the day, the original cult of the Emperor, known as the Daughters of the Emperor, well, they weren't particularly powerful. They would eventually reach a grand total strength of 500 members when Gog Vandir found them, but they certainly wouldn't have started with 500. And even 500 is not much of a military force with which to engage the great enemy, now is it? They would have started out as a handful of individuals, a small covenant, a tiny grouping, a local defensive militia perhaps, or something along those lines, and their resources would have been extremely limited, as we see in their development of their characteristic fighting style utilizing twin pistols. They also developed a variety of martial arts to make the best of what they had at hand. Simple close-quarter weaponry, basic small arms, slug throwers, pistols, the likes. And clearly, it was effective enough for them, and if it was good enough for the original founders, then surely it is good enough for the Seraphim of today. And so they trained with their characteristic twin bolt pistol style. They're also trained extensively in close-quarters combat, both with weapons like swords and handheld flamers, now that they are far more well-equipped than their predecessors ever were, and in unarmed hand-to-hand combat. This also does make a great deal of sense, actually. This is a piece of old Games Workshop lore where they actually thought about what they were creating rather than recently, where they figured to themselves, alright, if we're gonna have an order of all female warrior priestesses, they must have come from somewhere, right? And if that somewhere is also a militant order, then that means that at some point they must have been fighting mutants and heretics and monsters and all kinds of shit without power armor, without bolt pistols, without power swords, and without handheld flamers or anything. They would simply just be regular old gals fighting against the worst that the galaxy has to offer. In such a scenario, they'd probably want every advantage they could possibly get their hands on, and a pistol is certainly an advantage, particularly if you do not have the opportunity to match your opponent's physical strength. Now, a pistol may not be an ideal melee weapon, due to the fact that you're going to have to maneuver that thing into a position where you can actually fire it effectively, rather than simply swinging a sword or an axe, etc. But if you're a 120-pound woman fighting a 240-pound mutant heretic, you probably want the extra stopping power. But on the other hand, a pistol also runs out of ammunition. Uncomfortably quickly, I imagine, on far too many an occasion, and so you're going to need a fallback weapon, one that guaranteeably doesn't run out of ammo. And so, developing martial arts focusing, one would guess, on joint locking techniques and submission moves would work out very, very well indeed, even for a 120-pound woman. And obviously, all of these martial art techniques will only be enhanced by the addition of power armor. Unsurprisingly. Especially as the power armor worn by the Seraphim are some of the best within their order, as the Seraphim are put on pedestals as, well, exemplars of virtue, of skill, and of purity. And that is, of course, entirely intentional, both because of the spiritual idea of going back to their roots, and because of the extraordinarily demanding form of combat that they are trained in. Being able to land in the middle of a nest of heretics from a jump pack descent at God only knows how many kilometers per hour, and then accurately fire a pistol ambidextrously in either hand at throngs of enemies, and then switch over to close quarters combat, unarmed if necessary, at the drop of a hat, is going to require some pretty serious drilling. Even more so if everything just happens to be on fire whilst you're doing it. Because, of course, one of the weapon options for the Seraphim is to put down the bolt pistols and pick up a pair of one-handed flamethrowers. Because why not? And I do feel the urge to raise a bit of an objection here. As fond as the Sisters of Battle are of flamethrowers, and as obvious as a theological reason they have for using them, purge the infidel, etc., I feel like close quarters shock troops might endanger each other almost as much as the enemy, with point-blank range flamethrowers being wielded ambidextrously, but oh well, details. At least in this regard, the other option, the Inferno pistol, seems more reasonable, since that is simply a pistol variant of a multi-melter. It's still a pretty ludicrous weapon, but at least here you've got to aim and fire a concentrated blast rather than merely spreading the fire around. The Seraphim can also use power swords, chain swords obviously, melter bombs, and plasma pistols, though, tragically, they are not allowed to dual wield plasma pistols, which, well, I imagine has less to do with their capabilities of doing so, I'm sure they could pull it off, and more to do with the fact that with the way Get Hots works in 40k, it would be pretty damn suicidal to try. Listen, I get as your faith protects you from enemy bullets and all that, But a plasma weapon detonating in your hands is going to require more than a sturdy conviction to see you emerge with a hand still intact. Tactical critique of handheld flamethrowers and melee aside, however, the Seraphim spend a long time perfecting their arts of warfare, and only the best amongst the Adeptus Sororitas can ever hope to be chosen to join their numbers, and it is the ultimate life goal of many to be considered for the honor. And the high status of the Seraphim is more than earned, as they are far more than simple soldiers, though they do what they do exceptionally well. The Seraphim are shock assault infantry, intended to arrive from a clear blue sky without a hint of warning. Besides, that is, a sudden, overwhelming roar of jump jets firing to slow their final descent. And before the enemy can pick themselves off the ground, they will be in amongst them in a spinning, beautiful ballet of death. Bolt pistols blazing from both hands, cutting down enemies left and right simultaneously. And when a whole squad lands upon the enemy, the slaughter, particularly in the opening seconds, must be terrific indeed. Even more so if you throw in some confusion weapons. A frag grenade here, a burst of burning promethium there. It'll be difficult for an enemy to organize to deal with the intruders that so suddenly emerged in their midst. And this confusion, of course, is as much a weapon as any other in the Seraphim's arsenal, as they are actually deceptively flexible units, carrying with them, potentially, a decent variety of light anti-vehicle weaponry, and even something that can pack a real punch. Infernal pistols may have very short range, but that doesn't matter so long as you've got the nice flank or rear of a vehicle to shoot at, and if it's still too tough, crack grenades and melter bombs will probably do the job just fine before the Seraphim shoot off into the sky again to escape the explosion, leaving behind nothing more than a burning wreckage and a ton of dead infantry. But this is naturally not the end of the Seraphim's utility. As mentioned, only the finest of sisters amongst the entire order would ever be considered for elevation into their ranks. This gives them a unique position of respect and honor within the order, not just for their incredible training, but also for what they represent, the core of their traditions, the purest amongst them, those who have returned to their roots and have emerged better for it. This means that in many cases, abbesses, canonesses, and leaders of Adeptus Sororitas' armies will often confer with the members of their Seraphim squad, even occasionally deferring to their experience and knowledge in certain scenarios. And not without good reason either. As mentioned, the Seraphim are drawn from amongst the best in the order, but they can come from any other specialization, often giving a canoness priceless extra information. And then, of course, there is finally the Seraphim's perhaps most impactful attribute: their simple appearance. They look like angels on wings of fire, flying high above the battlefield and bringing swift death and devastation to the enemy. Many an imperial force has been heartened by their appearance, an absolutely invaluable moral boost to the fighting men and women of the Imperial Guard. Unsurprisingly, they've also spawned their fair share of battlefield myths, legends, and rumors as well. Maybe it was a Seraphim squad, but maybe it was actual angels sent by the God Emperor himself. Perhaps it's obvious then and there, but as the history of the battle evolves, well, there are quite a few examples of the Emperor's angels being recorded, literal angels, not space marines in this case, being recorded as having intervened in various imperial conflicts. Who knows? The Emperor at this point certainly is psychically powerful enough to create some entities of his own, and one can certainly look at the living saints of the Sisters of Battle and think demon. But maybe many of these fanciful myths are simply accounts of seraphims flying into battle on their jump packs. And frankly, does it matter? It didn't matter to those fighting alongside them at the time, and it certainly won't matter to the plebeian masses of the Imperium 100 years later. As the image of an angel can be almost as powerful as the real thing, especially if the image is carrying a pair of enormously heavy-calibered pistols. But even here, the duty of a seraphim does not end just yet, as beyond the battlefield and beyond advising battlefield commanders, the seraphim are also usually called upon to train fresh generations of Sisters of Battle. This tends to be one of the, quote-unquote, retirement paths for the Adepta Sororitas. Retirement path indeed, where the best amongst them will move on from the active battlefield duty to train another generation in how to survive and how to best slay the God Emperor's foes, teaching not only advanced combat techniques, tactics, and perhaps even strategy, but also self-control and spirituality, impressing upon the next generation that their best weapon is not a bolt pistol, it is not a jump pack, it is not even a relic blade. It is their eternal faith in the God Emperor of mankind. For so long as they believe in him, he will always grant them victory, at least in theory. On occasion, even Big E needs the help of a pair of expertly wielded bolt pistols, after all. Until next time, I'm Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.